Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the Piano Pedagogy Podcast. My name is Jacqueline Beckoff, and I own a successful music studio in Southern California. And with me, as always, is Arianne Lacra, who also owns a successful music studio in Southern California. How are things going for you this week, Arianne?
Things are going good, just the usual thing, working, coming home, working around the house, and repeat. And
That's
you?
I'm getting ready for my studio recital. And I'm on Saturday, and then I have my audition for grad school on Friday, and super nervous about the audition. I have not had a performance with consequences in like 3.5 years.
A performance with consequences. I like that way of putting it. Well, hey, I think you're going to do great and, just give it your best. And at the end of the day, you are super familiar with the professors who will be doing the judging and, things should go smoothly.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that it will go okay, but I haven't been in this mindset in a good long while. One of the things I tell my students to help them with their performance anxiety is that it doesn't like their performances have no consequences, right? It's not as if a job is riding on their recital. It's not as if they're getting into school with their recital, and there really is nothing to actually be anxious about. But that doesn't apply when there are actual consequences to how a performance goes, whether it's a jury performance for a grade or a senior recital, or if you're auditioning to get a job. All of those, unfortunately, have actual consequences.
Didn't you already get into the program once?
But I used my senior recital. I was at the highest point of my performance career, and I didn't even have to audition. I just used my senior recital as my audition to get into grad school. And
Oh.
since I got out of the program, I haven't done a whole ton haven't done a lot of practicing. I was focusing on teaching.
Got it. Well, that's a cool thing I didn't know you could do. Use your senior recital as your audition.
Yeah, they told me I could do it. Even if I didn't, like it's still I had all those pieces memorized. I haven't memorized a piece of music in 3 years because I've just not had to. And
Ah,
I'm good at teaching memorization, but it's never been a super strong skill that I've had. So this is the first memorized performance in 3.5 years.
wow.
Well, 3 years, I guess.
And you feel good about, well, have you memorized everything?
Um, ish. Some of the pieces I already had memorized because they were from study at the university. But there was one new one, the Melody No. 3 by Fanny Mendelssohn. That is a completely new one, and I didn't have that one memorized previously. So I've been doing a chord map. Because it's so heavily chord based, and it's just overwhelming. It's basically a rondo. So there's 3 A sections, and then there's 2 B sections, and then there's a C section, and then a couple D sections. It's like A, B, A, A prime, B, A, C, D. It's a rondo for sure.
Wow. Wow. Well, it helps that you happen to be, very interested in Fanny Mendelssohn and her work, you know.
Yeah,
Never
for
hurts to
sure.
like your composer that you're performing.
I read some research about that about 3.5, 4 years ago, that one of the best ways for students to have better outcomes with memorized music is that they should be playing music that is passionate, that they are passionate about, that they care about. And if we think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because some of these pieces that our students just brute force, like they're in like the primer book, but they're brute forcing their way through Fur-Elise, and they manage to they manage to memorize that rendition of Fur-Elise that they come up with, because it's something that they are very excited for. So I did find that the Fanny Mendelssohn music that I did for my recital, and the Lily Boulanger music that I did for my recital, the music by the female classical composers, I was much more passionate about it, and I had a much easier time memorizing it, for sure.
Same goes with me with my Florence Price pieces. I don't know, something just really resonates with me when I play her work. So it's great to have a composer or two that are like that for you.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm excited to go back to grad school. Potentially, I still haven't actually applied. I'm waiting on the outcome of this audition, because it's just going to be so much work. It's going to be so much work, but I'm excited because there's just so much that you learn and so much that you read, and you're just immersed in that environment where you are just learning so much about it. And but our topic today is one that we are all probably very familiar with, is staff reading. We're all very interested in staff reading and the best way to teach it to our students, because it is probably the least intuitive thing that we do. We spoke a little bit about this in a previous episode, that staff reading is very, very non-intuitive. None of it just makes natural sense, right? You don't look at any of it and be like, oh yeah, obviously. Yeah. Have you found that is one of the stumbling blocks for students?
Oh yeah, some students pick it up instantly. Some of them you have to go through a few exercises, games, flashcards, worksheets. Note spellers tend to help a lot. And on the topic of note spellers, that kind of brings me to, I guess, our hot button issue of the day, which is to teach the mnemonics or not to teach the mnemonics. That is the question.
I think that those of you who have heard us in our previous episode, both we know, my stance on mnemonics. I absolutely despise mnemonics. I hate mnemonics. They are such in my opinion, they are such a bad way to teach. What is your opinion on mnemonics, Arianne?
And I like them.
Well, here we go. Here we go. So we're gonna be at odds then. So I would say that there are 4 different approaches to staff reading. Right? There's 4 different approaches to staff reading. There's mnemonics, there are positions, there is intervallic, and then there is a hybrid of them, right? There's a hybrid. I suppose also some teachers don't teach any of that, and they just use flashcards. They just do things over and over and really get students in. But I am a big fan of the intervallic method with guide notes. That's the method that Faber pushes in the Piano Adventures.
Sponsored by Faber. No, I'm kidding.
Oh God, I wish Faber call us.
I wish.
They use guide notes, but personally for me, I was taught using mnemonics, and I was taught using positions. Can we agree at least that positions is the worst approach?
Meaning, so can you explain to the audience what you're referring to here?
So positions are when a book or will say, okay, this is the position that we're learning, middle C position. That's with both thumbs on middle C. And then we do C position, which is when we are in the C scale. And then we have the G position, and then the F position. And students are taught to identify the position that a piece is in. They don't often move outside of that position. generally the progression from one position is that a piece will have one position, and then they'll be doing pieces where they move from one position to the next. But all of the students that I've had, all the transfer students that I've had that have been taught on positions, you put a note on a board, and they try to, they try to contextualize it within a position, right? They try to contextualize a note within a position. And if you give them a note outside of that position, they are, they'll get it wrong because they're just going to try to contextualize it. So if you put them in like the C position with like right hand number one on C, and you test them on a couple of those notes, and then you throw an A at them, they might say it's an F because they're trying to fit that into their position. So I think the technical term for that is called multi-key. I think it's multi-key.
Yes, I would say typically my students, maybe transfer students might get along better with that approach, but it's pretty rare in my experience for a student to really flourish on only the multi-key approach. Not that I've tried it extensively, because my philosophy around staff note identification on the staff is to just give a student several different ways that they can reinforce their knowledge of notes on the staff and the positions of the notes on the staff. So I don't have one solid approach, but I do lean heavily on the use of flashcards, note speller workbooks that they take home and do for homework each week. And also, flashcard, note speller, and of course, mnemonics. And a caveat here with mnemonics, it's really important, I'd say, to, yes, isolate concepts and things and work on concepts away from the piano at times. But when it comes to learning mnemonics, if you say that, say, the bass clef space notes are, all cows eat grass, that doesn't inherently teach the student what register that A or C or E or G will be in. All it'll tell them and alert them to is the letter name. So mnemonics on their own are definitely not enough to teach a student staff notation. I think it helps to do lots of different things, but I use the acronyms or the mnemonics as a reinforcing mechanism for students who already are familiar with things like guide notes.
Gotcha. So my distaste for multi-key and the mnemonics is from my education from a very early age. It's just pedagogy, even just 25 years ago, was much less developed, and a lot of it was just kind of, just throw all the information at the student. All cows eat grass, face, good boys do fine always, every good boy does fine. First of all, why are there two slightly different mnemonics that are both about boys? Like, can we not be a little bit more diverse here? I mean, girl starts with G. Girls start with G. Anyway, sorry. But it took me a very long time to be able to look at a note and just identify it, and without having to go through all cows eat, every good boy, without having to go through the mnemonics. And I have a student that was a transfer student. He's been with me for quite a while now, probably about a year and close to 2 years. And I have never once used the mnemonics with him, but he will still look at notes that should be something that you can just identify by looking at, and go through the mnemonics. So he's been taught to use something to help him figure out his note rather than a method that culminates in just knowing the notes.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to, man, I was looking at a TikTok recently. This is going to veer off just a tiny bit, but I promise it's related. My famous last words when I'm about to go on a huge tangent. No, I'm kidding.
Us
Okay.
get off topic? Never.
I saw this TikTok about math class, where in one country, I'm not going to say which country, but you could totally guess as the audience if you wanted to. There's a country that teaches that 5 divided by 1/3 is 15. And all you have to do is do 5 times the reciprocal of 1/3. So 5 times 3/1 is 15. Easy, right? And that's how I think I was taught to divide a number by a fraction. Just times it by the reciprocal of that fraction. But then in the US, what they do now for Common Core, like with kids these days, Gen Alpha and everything, is they have them draw 5 circles and draw each circle, divide each circle into like thirds, like a pie that's been divided into 3 equal slices. And then count all of the slices and then say, oh, okay, it's 15. Because there are 15 total, like 1/3 slices when you do 5 divided by 1/3. And in the comment section of this TikTok, I was like looking, and people were just really hating on the US Common Core method of having the students do it that long way. And people were like, oh, this country, other country that shall not be named, is so much faster. Like all the kid had to do was go to the board, write it, do their multiplication. That was it. But this American student stayed there for like 5 times the amount of time drawing everything out. Why are they doing that in the US? And I was like, well, I can understand the merits of this Common Core method. It's an unpopular opinion that even though it takes longer, they're teaching the students how to reason through why they've been taught that dividing something by a fraction is the same as multiplying the reciprocal. That way, you're not just memorizing something and not questioning it. You're being taught to question it, work through it, reason your way through a solution. And then hopefully you can learn that shortcut mentally kind of afterwards with a more explicitly visual approach. So
I think. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So in the same way with these mnemonics, like I think it's important for the student to have some critical thinking skills, and be taught these critical thinking skills of like, why is it every then good then boy? Oh, well, because A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, etc. Like we're going in alphabetical order, but skipping. So of course the student needs to know that. And only then will they be allowed to use the mnemonics in my class, because they need to know the reason why we're using the mnemonics first. And if they can do that already and they can reason through everything and think critically already, then mnemonics are just a way for them to arrive at the same answer faster. So it's like employing the approach used by both countries for that math problem I was talking to her about earlier.
I think it's interesting because dividing a whole number by a fraction and ending up with a larger number is very counterintuitive. I think it doesn't make a whole lot of sense until you are realizing that you're asking how many times the fraction goes into the larger number, which is what first of all, Common Core, and I'm going to get on a rant here, and some of our listeners may not agree with me. Common Core, first of all, is not a teaching method. Common Core is one universal set of standards across the entire United States, and it is not a teaching method. You can teach with various methods to arrive at the same information, the same standard, right? It's about standards, not about methods. So in this example, we're trying to arrive at staff reading. That is the standard. We would all agree that we want our students to get to a point of fluency with staff reading, right? Mm-hmm. That they can just look at the notes and understand them just like we do. Right? Just like we do, hopefully. And whatever method you get there. But I'm not going to go on a rant about Common Core. It's just, there's a lot of misinformation about Common Core. I really have no stake in this game. I just don't like it when people are saying things that's not quite true. But back on to topic, because I'm not going to get distracted and talk about Common Core. I'm not. I think that it's an important distinction, using the shortcut instead of the long way, because the long way helps to teach the process. It helps to teach the process, and it helps. We need to be focused on processes as teachers instead of results, right? You need to be focused on processes instead of results, because it doesn't matter if your student can show the results if they have no idea how to form the thoughts and go through the process needed to arrive at that answer, right? Because if they're struggling with a note, the easiest solution is just to tell them the note, that's a C. That's not going to do anything for them to correct that mistake, that misconception in the future, right? So going through the processes, and I mean, it's sometimes painful. It can be painful, especially with transfer students, to sit there and take 5-6 minutes to walk them through processes of arriving at the right answer, when it would just be so easy to just be like, that's a G. That's a G, right? And the reason it's a G is because insert explanation here, whichever one of the explanations you want to go with, whether it's multi-key, whether it's guide notes, whether it's mnemonics, whether it's whatever it is. I think that it's so important for us to be focused on that process so that they can understand it, right? Teach a man to fish versus give a man a fish, right? Mm-hmm. Teach a child to staff read versus giving the child the answer to the staff reading, right?
Yeah, and of course, when a student gets older, a little more mature, more able to reason their way through things like why on earth is the lowest line of the treble clef E, and then the second line is a G, it doesn't make any sense, yada yada. Yeah, you can teach someone the memorization approach and they'll get it really quickly. But if you begin to poke around and ask questions such as why, then you will find that if you've taught your students to memorize certain answers, they won't necessarily be able to tell you why. Some will, because they ask themselves why already. They're self-motivated, critical thinkers. Others will just accept what you teach them. They'll get it. They'll comprehend what you're saying and retain it. But that's, again, going back to, the stages of learning. That's just the first stage of being able to learn something, analyze it, evaluate it, and then, create, which would be the highest level of learning. Composition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that why is an important one, and it's not, and some of us may not even have that answer immediately because we haven't had to ask ourselves why this note is the way it is, depending on the way that you teach. And the answer is, of course, it has to do with the clef, right? It has to do with the clef. So when I teach staff reading, I always am very focused on the clefs, and Piano Adventures makes that very easy because the first 3 notes that they teach is bass F, middle C, and treble G. So you can focus on the why. They don't really, they give it a very brief mention that it has to do with the letter F, and it has to do with the way the letter F used to be written, and it kind of morphed into the bass clef over time. Same with the treble clef. You can highlight where the letters are. You can have them draw a G on a whiteboard. The staff has been, to highlight that. So going into the why, I think is something that is paramount. Absolutely. If they can't tell you why something is the way that it is, then they really don't know it.
Right. At that point, they're just memorizing things that are way easier to forget because there's a lot less reinforcing happening in the brain for that particular student.
Yeah. And the work that I start, I think in a previous episode, I think actually it was one of our first episodes. It might have been actually our very first episode when we talked about preparation stage learning. That was one of our first couple. I think one of the examples I provided was how I teach the staff, actually, how I prepare a student for the staff. Do you think that it would be worthwhile to revisit that, Arianne?
Sure.
So first of all, the biggest things that, for those of us who haven't seen preparation stage learning. Preparation stage learning is little seeded, you seed information, you plant little nuggets that you culminate when you turn that page and they see the grand staff for the first time. Instead of turning that page for the grand staff for the first time and then having about 5-10 minutes of you explaining brand new things they've never seen before, such as the treble clef, such as the bass clef, such as the lines and spaces. So the first time a student sees a treble clef is before, in some cases, before, depending on their age group, before they even know the letters of the white keys for me. Treble clef means high sounds at that point, and bass clef means low sounds at that point. We practice drawing them, and at every piece that they play, they will take the opportunity with a regular pencil to draw in a treble clef for the right-hand notes above middle C and draw in a bass clef for the left-hand notes below middle C. So they're being taught the high and low from that early stage. From there, once they are on the white keys and we're getting ready to get to the grand staff, I have a whiteboard that has the staff on it, and I will write in a letter name, for example, G, on the second line of the treble clef staff. There is no treble clef at this point, just a G. And then we'll put notes on there and we'll say, well, what's below G? What's a step below that note? And kind of practice just reading in this new way, even though there are no clefs. So we're not really talking about what the staff is. We're not naming anything. We're just starting at the treble G and bass F and going either up or down in seconds so that we eventually arrive at middle C. And you can say, whoops, it looks like we ran out of lines. Why don't we just go ahead and draw another one? And they all think that that's the funniest thing in the world. They're like, we're just going to draw an additional line. I'm like, absolutely. Then when we get to the grand staff, they see the familiar things they've already seen, the lines, they've seen the spaces, they've seen the treble clef, they've seen the bass clef, and it's just culminating a bunch of pieces of information that they already have. At that point, we can talk about the history of the treble clef and the bass clef, talk about their nicknames, G clef, F clef, a lot of that why behind it, so that when they get there, it's not a bunch of brand new things, going from off staff reading to staff reading. It is a culmination of a bunch of different elements that they've been using basically since, for weeks or months at that point.
Nice. One thing I really like to do to communicate the why of why on earth we use this notation system instead of using something more like I don't know. Have you heard of synthesia?
The bane of my existence. Yes.
Yeah. It's kind of the bane of mine too, but I get it because it's the proper.
It's much more intuitive than what we do.
Exactly. It's a horizontal representation of notes, just like with the keyboard. Instead of vertical. I like to just take a flashcard that has both clefs on it, the whole grand staff, and turn it to the right at a 90-degree angle, turn it clockwise, set it on the book stand on the piano, and just go, well, okay, each line and space represents one white key. And then I kind of go into, if the student is old enough, I'll go into the music history of why we use a vertical system of notation, and it has to do with the history of Gregorian chant and all of that. And then I'll say, well, as a function of time, we want to write from left to right. And usually, at that point, at least the more adult students totally understand. The younger ones, I won't even I'll probably spare an explanation like that, but it tends to do the trick, especially if someone asks, the very astute question of why do we use this vertical notation system if the piano keys are laid out in a horizontal fashion?
Yeah, it's that that visual element of synesthesia, the falling notes. That's what, if, for those listening, if you don't know, the falling notes in the YouTube videos that light up and they sparkle and they have a length, and to the right is higher. They fall down on the keyboard. That is what we're discussing.
Yeah.
It is intuitive. It is intuitive, and staff reading is counterintuitive. Staff reading is maybe not, that's a bit far. It's just not intuitive. It's unintuitive.
Yeah, relatively very unintuitive.
I mean, it contradicts the direction that they're moving on the piano. So I guess it would it be fair to say that staff reading is unintuitive?
Yeah, again, I'm saying relatively, because as long as you have a strong understanding of like the XY relationship, actually, I mean, it is totally intuitive, but it just takes a lot of time to learn. It's intuitive to us.
It's but I use these whiteboards from a website called Music Escapades. Are you familiar with them?
No.
I will be sure to include them in the show notes for this episode. It for those of you can't see, it is a grand staff with 2 ledger lines above the treble clef staff, 2 ledger lines below the treble bass clef staff, and then the middle C ledger line. And at the top of the page, there is a piano. It's a whiteboard. It's magnetic. Comes with a set of a bunch of different letters and numbers and colors, just a whole bunch of different magnets. It's something that I actually I sell for students to take home, so that, for example, with like the guide note strategies we learn in our lessons on the big whiteboard, when they get stumped on a note at home, they can use the same method of puzzling out those notes, just like we talked earlier with like the 1/3 going the long way to get to an answer. But separately, Music Escapades also sells this magnetic keyboard. It's the full 88 keys. And when you put it on the whiteboard and you situate it just right, the lines and spaces will line up with the notes from the keyboard, the magnetic keyboard on here. So you can see that like the low C is a C, and it's a great visual representation. And you can just, to get that X and Y axis, you can have the staff the way it is, and then you can rotate it for the piano, and then you can rotate it back for the staff and rotate it for the piano, so that they're looking at it the way they will be. And it's a very good visual explanation, right? Because it is. I don't know if we can call something intuitive if we have to work very hard to explain it. But the XY, there is a relationship. Yes, XY, left, right, up, down. But it is not a thing that you can just look at like you can the YouTube videos with the falling notes and make the connection.
Exactly.
But by having them physically rotate the object and see, okay, now the piano is laid out the way it is. Okay, now I rotate it back, and now the staff is laid out the way that I see it in my music. That connection becomes very visual. Something that is kind of esoteric and unclear becomes very visual instead.
I have been searching for a product just like that for so long. I'm definitely going to order that product. Again, not sponsored at all, just been looking for something like that. I mean, I would make my own kind of version of that using my own magnetic whiteboard and literally like thin black strips of electrical tape or something. And then just magnets that I found at the office store that are like round shaped. And we would do the same sort of thing, but I could never really get my piano keyboards to print the exact size of whatever system I was using for the staff. So that's really nifty.
Yeah, and if
And
you
it helps
buy bulk, you can buy bulk and get a discount from Music Escapades so that you can sell to your students.
to your students. Awesome. Well, I'm glad I learned about that today. Thank you for sharing that hack.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Um, but other than note reading, right? There's a lot of other things on on the staff, right? It's very overwhelming. It can be, depending on how gentle your method book is, or perhaps those of you who may not use a method book, you might just drop your student into music on the staff right away. The prevailing pedagogy um, now is that you should have a lot of pre-staff reading before you get onto the staff. Would you agree with that, Ariane?
yeah, for most kids, I feel like they need that understanding, especially again, going back to the whole reading notes that get higher going up and lower going down on the page, just correlating that to left and right on the keyboard. I think it is important to introduce those things in a staggered manner instead of
Yeah,
all of
because at first, methods that just use black keys, we're teaching rhythm, we're teaching how to read rhythm, and then we're teaching up and down, the relationship of up and down, and that it does not correlate with left and right, because that is intuitive. As you go further up on the piano, you're going to the right. So as the notes read that way, maybe they go up. So we counteract that first, and then when we go from just black key reading to the pre-staff notation where the letter names are inside the note heads, we're now establishing the relationship with the white keys. And then some books take it a step further, that they do the names of the white keys inside the note heads on the staff, before
Mhm.
gradually removing that element as well. But I mean, there's what, that's one, two, three elements of staff reading. The rhythm, right? The rhythm element, the up and down, and then the white key names. That's what we're expecting one of our students, when they see a quarter note on the bottom line of the treble clef staff, we are expecting three things from them: that it is a quarter note, that it is an E, and that it is related in some way to the note that precedes it and the note that comes after it, either higher, lower, or a repeated note. And for
Yeah.
us, it's one concept. We're teaching them to read the staff, but there's these disparate elements that make up. It's quite a monolith of concepts.
That's a great point. Yeah. And so for a tabula rasa student, you might want to break it down. And I think the one missing link that I find in the Faber method would have to be including if they could just include some pieces that have letters inside the note heads while the students are learning from the staff. That would be great. Maybe I'm just not looking at the right Faber books. I only use a few, but that would be my missing link that I would like to see, because they do have letter names and note heads when we're not looking at the staff, but then suddenly when we get to the staff reading, the note heads the note heads are not lettered. And I kind of wish they were, because that would just reinforce things for a lot of students that are getting into staff reading.
There comes a point at every piano teacher's career when we say to ourselves, I should make a method book.
Yeah.
I should make a method book, just like I should. I need things to be the exact way that I think that they should go, and I've had the thought. I'm sure that a lot of listeners have had that thought, that like, why doesn't it just do this thing? And I think that because it isn't practical to design your own curriculum from scratch, especially as new teachers, that you find a method book that fits your principles as close as you can get it, and then you do out of the book activities such as the preparation stage learning that I was discussing, linking the notes to the staff before just turning that page and suddenly all of that stuff is there. I think there on the lesson book for the primer book, they have that page that has all A through G, bottom space of the bass clef staff,
Hmm.
high G. I think that's the only time that they do that in the primer book.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's true. It's crucial to fill in these lacunae here and there as needed, because no book is going to be able to really cover everything that you want to impart on your students. You'll just have to do it in a preparation stage activity or something like that, especially if the students are curious to learn more about a certain topic that wasn't really fleshed out in the book.
Yeah. Try not to limit yourself to what's available in the published book, right? You certainly don't need to do
Mhm.
every piece in the method book. First of all, sometimes you might feel like you don't need to do something. You can skip some of them, and sometimes you might feel like there's something missing here. There's a missing link. There's something that there's too many concepts that are being that our student is being asked to leap to at the same time, and by filling in those missing links, you can make that. You want to make the transition from off staff to on staff as smooth as possible, right? You
Mhm.
want to have as few hiccups as possible. And if you wait to introduce treble clef and bass clef, if you wait to introduce the lines and spaces, if you wait to introduce those until you're expecting them to remember all of that, it's going to probably have hiccups, right? Before I did the preparation stage learning, I would have students that would come back and there'd be problems. It would take weeks to get adjusted to the staff.
Yeah, and then if there is that sense of overwhelm in class, then the student will be more likely to go home and just feel unmotivated to practice. So, if you introduce preparation stage learning activities that ease them into these concepts so that by the time the unit rolls around, they'll be familiar with them, then they're actually more likely to visit the piano at home and practice and engage with the material in an environment when they don't necessarily have to. I mean, yeah, there's parent encouragement to practice while outside the lesson, but of course, the lesson is where there's the highest expectation to perform as a student.
Yeah, I think that's that you've hit the nail on the head there by talking about how unmotivating it is to practice something that you are just clueless about, right? Because is there even really a point for them to practice something that they don't understand, right? If they have no idea whether it's going to be right or not, how is that a productive use of their practice time? Because I aim for my students to never go home with something that they don't understand. I feel like that's a good goal
Yeah.
for every teacher to strive for, that no one should walk out of your studio door, or if you're a traveling teacher, you shouldn't walk out of someone else's door when they don't know fully what it is that they're supposed to practice. So if it's a syncopated rhythm, they need to have performed that rhythm and demonstrated competence with that. If it's staff reading, they need to have demonstrated competence with that. Perhaps the only thing that I might disagree with that about is polyrhythms. Polyrhythms, you gotta bang your head against the wall a little while until suddenly it clicks, right? So I think that's much further off than by then they're resilient, they're tough, they know that
Yes.
they can do that. But in the early stages, what is the point of someone leaving your studio if they don't know what they're supposed to do? Um,
And we've all had students that come in and it's evident that they did practice and they just happen to practice the entire piece, maybe with something going on, maybe like in a different part of the
and that's so
keyboard.
discouraging.
Yeah, so students do sometimes practice and then show up to class expecting, to be uh praised for how much they practice, and then there's that rude awakening that they have that, oh, they practiced in the wrong part of the keyboard. I'm totally guilty of having that happen with students in the past. And yeah, what could be more discouraging than that? You thought you did everything you were supposed to as a student. You came to class and supposedly you were prepared, so it is really important to set up a student for success before they go home for their practice session. This could be an entire podcast topic in itself. Like, how do you set up the student for a successful practice session at their home away from the lesson,
Absolutely.
But anyway,
I'm sure we'll get around to that at some point. Practice.
Yeah. Practicing good practice habits. That could be a new topic.
And it is so frustrating for us as teachers when they come back and the entire thing is just wrong. And, it's so easy for us to express our frustration at them during that. Why, just say, it's like, I told you the right thing. Why didn't you just do it the way that I told you? And of course, telling is certainly not teaching. But, it's never their fault. If they come back and the entire thing is wrong, but it's confidently wrong, then it was never their fault, right? If it's like, I don't know which notes to play, but if they rock up to the piano and they whip out their book with a smile on their face and they play their entire piece wrong, well, that's your fault, not their fault.
Totally.
And
agreed.
You have no right to get frustrated. I mean, you shouldn't get frustrated at your students in the first place, but absolutely in that situation, you have no right to get frustrated because that one is just squarely on your shoulders.
And what do you do when something like that happens? Because I usually try to do a compliment sandwich.
I do two in one. I really like this. This was awesome, but, or, and then, but compliment sandwich, good thing, good thing. Yeah.
And the more specific the compliment can be, the better, because then it's not just like, oh, you're saying good for whatever reason.
Because our criticism is always very specific.
Yeah. You got to this is one thing that they taught us in the master's program. Like, if you're going to praise your student, which, students thrive on praise, let's be real, it should be specific so that they know which behavior, practice habit, etc., is meant to be reinforced.
Absolutely. Simple. I mean, just think about when someone gives you a compliment on your appearance, which makes you feel better. I really like your makeup today, or you look nice, right? Like,
right.
It's something specific. That top looks great on you. That always is going to feel better than, wow, you look nice. So even when something is really, really bad, you need to find a way. Like, for example, that was a really beautiful legato. Well done. Unfortunately, you were supposed to play it with a different articulation, right? So you're always trying to find a way to make something good out of that, even when it feels like there's nothing. But I feel like also that could be another subject, another topic in and of itself. Providing feedback, criticism, encouragement, teacher talk, I think, was the lecture that's the topic that was called at university, teacher talk, virtuosic teacher talk. I remember a lecture about something like that.
Interesting. Ooh, I'd be interested to learn more about a lecture like that.
But where were we? The staff reading, right? So if you aim for them to never leave your studio without feeling confident that they know what they need to practice, and you absolutely should strive for that, then the staff is a huge stumbling block, right? Thinking about another concept that is such a huge stumbling block, eighth notes. Eighth notes are perhaps one of my most prepared concepts for students, because they used to be such a nightmare getting them onto eighth notes. And just now we're suddenly saying ands, and there's all of this new stuff. But I think that staff reading is just this massive thing. So you need to find a way to break it down into bite-sized chunks. And that is the staff, lines and spaces, it is the clefs, and of course the up and down.
Yeah, and I think supplemental workbooks, again, this is where they come into play. you can use your supplemental workbook to introduce a preparation stage concept. And that goes for new notes on the staff, because at least in the primer level piano adventures books, staff reading starts out with just middle C, then it introduces treble clef G, then it goes to bass clef F. These are the guide notes. And so that's kind of manageable, right? Because as long as a student can vaguely tell the difference between a middle C and literally anything else, and they know the staff and what hand to use, they'll be kind of okay. But then before you introduce other notes like D, E, and F, for me personally, at that point, that's when I like to lean on my workbooks a little bit. This is my recommendation. It uses acronyms, so maybe it wouldn't be a recommendation for audience members who resonate more with like Jackie's approach to teaching the staff. But I really like John Thompson's Note Speller book A for any students who are just learning the notes of the grand staff. And it isolates the concept, and you can choose what to assign so that they're doing whatever preparation stage activities are needed before it gets to their lesson book, workbook, repertoire, whatever.
Yeah, I think that the note spellers can be really useful, as can composition. Once you introduce the guide notes, for those of you who don't know what guide notes is, or perhaps you use a different method book other than the Piano Adventures, guide notes are a handful of notes that are also called landmark notes, that are easy to remember for one reason or another. And then you use either steps and skips or seconds and thirds. There are no notes further away than a second or a third from any guide notes. So by having those always nearby, you're able to then find your place. And that process can become automatic. I see that we're on the fourth line of the treble clef staff. I know that the space right below that is treble C. So I know that the one right above that is D. That's a process that can get shorter and shorter and quicker and quicker. And then all of a sudden, you don't need the middle C. You don't need the treble C. You just know that fourth line is D because you've gone through that process so many times. But assigning a composition, when the student knows their guide notes, middle C, treble G, and bass F, assigning a composition where the student needs to use all three of those forces them to consider where to put it on the staff, right? Going back to using the bass clef, the big dots on F, the two dots are flanking F above and below. So I know that's where F is in the bass clef. The treble clef curls around the second line of the staff. I know that's where G is. So forcing them to use, well, not forcing them, but assigning a composition where they need to use all three guide notes, where they need to literally draw the extra ledger line for middle C, where they need to literally take that action, is a great way to reinforce that skill before you move on to, as Arianne said, filling in D, E, and F in the treble clef, filling in G, A, B in the left hand, in the bass clef, filling in the, going lower, bass C, before adding those other things, just making sure that they really remember middle C, bass F, and treble G. And creating, as we've talked about, is the highest form of mastery with a concept. If you can write it down and then play it, it shows you that you knew what you were doing, and you're able to read what you were doing, and you had intention with what you were doing.
Yeah, and there are similar exercises by the time you get about halfway through the theory book in the primer level Faber set. So you're able to fill out like a Mad Libs style story about flapjacks and robots and stuff that include the three guide notes, which is nice because it's a different stage of the learning process for guide notes. And then later you get to kind of compose your own stuff, I believe. So you can ascend the rungs one at a time, at your student's pace. And eventually that culminates in composition. Where the playing of specific notes fits into that, in repertoire, I don't really know. Like, I don't know what should come first. Comprehending notes, filling in the blanks, labeling them with the correct letter, like in a note speller fashion, playing the notes in repertoire, composing the notes in your own piece. Like, I don't really know the proper order, or if there is a proper order.
Experiencing it on the staff, I think, is important to have first. Otherwise, you risk, like, I feel like you risk not having the context that is that crucial context of, okay, I know that this is a C, but I mean, there's what, 7 C's on the piano, or is it 6? I don't know off the top of my head. I don't know.
7 or 8.
7 or 8. Something like that.
That
Anyway,
sounds-
knowing which C it is, why is it this one? I feel like you might risk that, and experiencing it before being tested is important. And I feel like writing it down is a form of testing, because you're being asked a question, you're being asked to fill in the blank, right? For example, these 3 questions, or I don't know how many questions, these questions are all different stages of learning. What note is that? Can you point to middle C? Can you draw me middle C on the staff, right? Name, or I already asked that one. So like naming the note, playing the note, drawing the note, identifying from a group of notes which one is C. Those are all different stages of learning. It's very easy for us to group them all together. Well, yeah, you play it, you can read it, you can write it, you can do all of those things, but they all represent different stages of mastery with a concept, and culminating with writing it down on your own, and composition, or I mean, I suppose theory. The note speller books would be like that. If you are a fan of the guide note approach, Faber has, I think they're called I Can Read Music. They're note speller books that use the guide note approach instead of the mnemonic approach.
I actually use that for my violin students. I Can Read Music. They're pretty awesome. Good preparation stage learning.
Yeah, it's great. I used to lean heavily on flashcards. I used to lean heavily on note spellers. I used to. I have so many flashcards, and I honestly, the only student that I use them with is one of my autistic students who I struggle to work on processes with him, because he is not able to share his thoughts with me. So I don't know what he's thinking. All I know is the outcome that I get out of his mouth, or from his fingers. So flashcards have been useful for him, because walking him through that process of guide note to step up, step down, skip up, skip down. Walking him through that process was never possible. So even if you have your preferred approach, as I do, it's never a one size fits all solution. You'll have situations where one student needs something different than your usual approach, but you probably will come up with an approach that is a unique blend of a lot of different things that works with most of your students.
Yeah. And quickly going back to the idea about quizzing, so to speak, or testing a student on a concept that they haven't totally digested yet. I think that could be really discouraging for a student, and it's definitely a teaching faux pas that I've seen myself guilty of in my earlier days of teaching, and a lot of other teachers who are just starting out in their careers. They'll skip to the quizzing about a new concept way too soon, and then the student gets discouraged, frustrated, and they don't understand why they still don't know the answer to something, even though they're generally a good student in every other field, every other subject, right? Because public school public school teachers, just teachers in general, know that first you got to go through all these activities before the culminating quiz or test. So just something to be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, it is in a public school teacher's best interests not to quiz a student before they are confident that the student can demonstrate competency, because teachers in a lot of places are they have incentives based off of grades, pass fail rates. They get reviewed based off of how well their classes are doing. So it is not in a lot of teachers' best interests to give them a quiz, a written exam, a homework, or something that's graded until they demonstrate competency with it, because otherwise, it can reflect poorly on them. Quizzing, I mean, I used to quiz like 30 seconds after I'd introduce a concept.
Yeah, and that kind of goes into like, what is the definition of quizzing? Is it a formal activity, or is it, I define quizzing a little bit more loosely, just as the act of asking the student
For an answer.
something.
Yeah, flashcards are quizzing.
Yes, exactly. So you can do flashcard activities that aid in the teaching process, that are not simply just showing the student a flashcard and asking what is the answer. You can also say, oh, I have 50 flashcards. I have, I don't know, 30 flashcards here. Can you put them all in order, on the ground? Like, let's go to the floor, go to the carpet, sit there, and put all these notes in order so that we can train your eye to tell the difference between the lines and all these spaces. And that's an example of a flashcard activity that is less on the quizzing side and more on this is just an activity kind of side. That's how I tend to use them, less in a quizzing way. So that's another caveat that goes with flashcards as an approach to teaching staff reading.
I have these little wooden tiles that are the width of a white key. I have one set that has letter names on them, and I have one set that has staff notation on them. And again, we're not sponsored by Music Escapades, but they are from Music Escapades. They are the perfect size to put on the staff. So when a student learns the white keys, we go from the very lowest white key all the way up to the very highest white key, and we put every single white key on there, all of the white keys, all 50 something, whatever there are, of the white keys on there. And the same thing can work for the staff, right? You give them the tile that has middle C on it, and you ask them to place it on the correct place on the piano. It's again making the connection between staff to piano, right? I feel like,
very important.
This episode has been so useful for me to remind myself of these methods that they work so well. I have them in my studio, but I sometimes just don't pull them out when I'm going through something like this with a student. Responding to your point about quizzing, games can be a form of quizzing that are in a relaxed setting, but still, you should never ask your student a question. Well, never is a strong word, but you shouldn't ask your student a question unless you're reasonably confident that they have the right answer.
Mm-hmm.
Can I say never? Can I say never?
Hey, I mean, I'm not the police here, so go for it.
I think that it's fair to say that you should try to find alternative forms of assessing students' knowledge without asking them a question that then you reply to, oh, that's not it, you got it wrong, or that's not quite right. Even if you're being more gentle about it, it still feels bad, right? So you shouldn't ask your student to point out which one's middle C unless you're reasonably sure that they know that, because the experience for some students, it's very difficult. The experience of getting a question wrong can be intensely stressful for some students.
Yeah, and so the nature of questions that can be really useful in these stages of learning, if you're going to ask questions as a teacher, like questions in general, I would say like aim for them to be rhetorical is not really the perfect word that I'm looking for, but a question that you would imagine a teacher would be asking rhetorically as part of a lesson, like, "Ooh, how do we figure out da 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 da? Oh, I'll show you." Blah. So it's a kind of question that you just ask yourself as a teacher, and you say it out loud so they know what question to be listening for the answer to.
Yeah, I think I'm veering into to teacher talk territory, and I'd love to do an
Yeah,
episode about that. But you should never ask an open-ended question that needs a certain answer for you to proceed, right? Like, you should
yeah,
never ask, like, what is the most important part of this piece, if you have one answer in mind, right? You shouldn't answer that, because then they say, I think the dynamics are the most important. You're wrong. That's clearly not the most important thing, because I had a different answer in mind, and my lesson can't proceed till you give me the right response, right? So,
I have
um,
had literal university professors do that, and I'm like, how did you go through your entire, like, you're a university professor, you should know that this is like one of the biggest no-nos in teaching, right? An open-ended question that only calls for one specific answer. And so all of the poor college students in my class are trying their hardest to answer the question, and all of them are wrong. Big pet peeve of mine.
well, yeah, you're trying. It's basically like you're just trying things out to get the right response out of your teacher at that point, right? Because the student will consider and say, I think that this is really important, and then you say, no, that's not really the right answer, or that's not quite, maybe not the most important thing. Would you like to try again? And now they're not thinking, they're not using their own knowledge to evaluate what they think is the most important. Now they're like, what does my teacher think is the most important thing?
Right. And it can be subjective, not every expert even agrees with every other expert. So it's important to take just the reality of our field into consideration. This is music, it's not necessarily physics or mathematics where there's just one correct answer to some question based on a theory. It's our questions are a little bit more subjective in nature. So
If you're, and then this is the last thing I'm going to say about teacher talk. Maybe we'll do it next week. If you need certain types of answers, you can start filling in the blanks with wrong answers. For example, like, what is the name of that note? We know it's not bass F. Do you know which one it
mm,
might be? Right? Or just alternative activities like, can we grab a colored pencil and highlight or trace the second line of the treble clef staff? Okay, now we've talked about how important that line is. What note is on that line, rather than just saying, what note is that, right? Going through the process and highlighting line number 2, connecting it with the treble clef, going back to previous teachings, and then asking the question, right?
mhm.
But evaluating knowledge should be done in the most casual way possible. Without, I know some of us might be thinking, well, it's very difficult. How do you know if a student knows something unless you just ask them? But that will have to wait for another episode, because we have been off topic here for long enough. But seriously, very interested in doing a teacher talk episode.
Oh yeah, yeah, that would be great. Especially as someone who like really was a pretty awkward conversationalist and still arguably am. But especially going into teaching, like when I didn't know how to act right, because I was just in my early 20s and just a mess in general. Um, yeah, I didn't know how to talk to students. So teacher talk episode could be very helpful because we could talk about things we've picked up and learned along the way. Going back to staff
Staff
reading
reading.
though, um, what would you say is like your least favorite part about the process of teaching staff reading?
My
And what is
least
your favorite?
favorite. My favorite. For me, because of this way, I actually really enjoy staff reading, because once I learned about preparation stage, in the very first one of the very first classes in the pedagogy program, that I went. It was like the second week back in 2018, and we're talking about preparation stage learning, and it something really just clicked in my head because some of these concepts, they're just, I felt like I as a teacher failed to teach them correctly over and over again. And there was a whole mess of things wrong with my teaching at that point. A lot of it was just saying things rather than teaching things. But I think that my favorite part of teaching staff reading these days is how fluid and seamless I've managed to make the transition for some students, um, getting from off staff to on staff. I've managed to get it so that for some students, it just seems like a natural continuation of what we've already been doing, instead of turning this page and all of a sudden, literally everything is different.
Wow, that's awesome.
What about you? What is your favorite part of teaching the staff reading?
My favorite part is all the light bulb moments because
Hmm.
it's relatively difficult to get to the point where you start teaching staff reading and staff notation, and then but it makes the clicks, all the more rewarding to me and to the student when things do fall into place, and when students do start to understand, say, the horizontal vertical relationships, to the keyboard staff, and they start to apply that and use the lines and spaces. I really like my John Thompson workbook. So students, you know, I remember growing up and doing lots of note speller workbooks when I was learning how to become fluent in staff reading and writing. Um, and I remember dreading it, like, to a certain degree, because, it's a whole page of stuff. It feels like math homework. But then as a teacher, I noticed that a lot of my students are excited to present me with their their note speller homework each week, because it's kind of like a point of pride. They spent the most time working on this outside of, like, actually practicing whatever repertoire they had going on. And so when I give them that little red pen smiley face at the top of the page after they've gotten all basically every answer correct, or just things like that, I see their faces light up, and that is definitely my favorite part. My favorite part is, like, recognizing that this is probably the first time that they have encountered what I would refer to as type 2 fun in music, where the whole process, like, honestly sucks. But then when you get to the end of it, you look at how far you come, and you just feel proud of yourself for overcoming all of it.
I like that. I think light bulb moments can be so rewarding for both teacher and student, and they are such a memorable experience when a student just clicks and everything slots into place and it makes sense. Creating as many first of all, light bulb moments, they just feel good for the student.
Mhm.
They feel really good. And we want our students to feel good about learning. We want them to feel like they are capable and competent. So creating situations where they can then have those moments of elation because they're like, oh, that makes sense, that's great, and they just smile, they light up, and they feel like they're on cloud nine because we've led them to a conclusion really well without outright stating the conclusion that we need them to come to. And they come to that conclusion on their own and it feels good, or they've gotten a whole bunch of things right and it feels good, or all of these different things suddenly slot into place and it feels good. But creating those aha moments or those light bulb moments, they are a really big treat for our students, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. Did I say what my least favorite part was? I don't know. Should
No.
we? Should we?
Sure. What's your least favorite? You start, and then we'll do our takeaways after I say my least favorite part.
Sure. My least favorite part about staff reading, I hate to end this on, like, not a positive note, but it's fine. I would have to say it's just the amount of times that I feel like I sometimes have to do the work of reinforcing concepts in the lessons, or clearing out the cobwebs from week to week if the student is already feeling discouraged that now they've reached that point where they have to really start learning how to read notes on the staff instead of just winging it or using their memorization. Um, just having to over and over say things to a certain student that I've already said, or question my teaching method because it's just a hard concept for my student to grasp. That is probably the part that I'm still, it's a work in progress. I'm not the perfect teacher. I'm still learning every day how to communicate certain concepts more effectively, and learn new teaching hacks. Staff notation and reading is definitely an area where I just I'm just going to come out and say it. I haven't totally gotten it down yet. And I'll let you know when I feel like I have a foolproof system. But everybody in my studio is just so different with regard to how they get their light bulb moments that I just have to kind of go around in the dark until I find what works for that particular student in that moment with staff reading.
Gotcha. So when you have to reinforce something for the umpteenth time, that is your least
Yeah.
favorite. Um,
Mhm.
I think that my least favorite part about staff reading is transfer students. That they have had a because I have it fine tuned to such an extent with students that are going through as a tabula rasa student, as a student that's never done music before, and then that it feels so natural for the vast majority of my students. And then you get the student in here and they have bits and pieces of a completely different method that clearly did not work 100%. Otherwise,
Yeah.
I wouldn't need to be doing remedial work with them. Um, and I think that is I think that is my least favorite part. The remedial nature of transfer students that don't have it 100% when they come in, um, because they have baggage from the previous method, and maybe the previous method never was it just never had a chance to be seen all the way through to completion. I'm not going to
Yeah.
judge. Well, sometimes I judge, but I'm not going to judge another teacher's methods based off of a transfer student. Um, but maybe their method didn't get seen to completion, and for whatever reason, the student is like halfway in the door with it, and that's very difficult to try to do. So that's my least favorite part.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, people transfer for so many reasons. Sometimes it's unexpected, and if that whole teaching process that best case scenario the teacher had planned to complete wasn't completed, then that can throw things off. And then if it contends with yours, or it is different with the way that you usually go about teaching something, then the student is kind of in a position where they're like, oh, what the heck? Like, now I have to rework everything mentally. Um, but yeah, the light bulb moments for transfer students make it worth it for me, because I feel like with a lot of transfer students who are at the late elementary, early intermediate level, where they're still working out things about the staff, um, it it's a challenge, and it's a challenge that usually I feel energized to try to address, you know, and a challenge that I want to beat. And then it's the best when when they finally get it.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. It takes a lot of energy to overcome those hardships with transfer students. And if you are feeling overworked, or if it's been too long since you've had time off, um, those moments can just be so soul crushing when it seems like you're not getting anywhere. And those moments require you to innovate and do something outside of your method, because your method, it works from the get-go, right? Your method that you've put together over years of teaching works from the point where a student doesn't know anything, because that's what the vast majority of our students are coming to us with. So it requires us to think much more outside of the box, much more away from the methods that are our tried and true methods, and it can just be overwhelming. So
Yeah.
for sure. Big takeaways. Did we already do big takeaways? No, we haven't. Big takeaways. What is your big takeaway on staff reading, Arianne?
Honestly, my big takeaway is I'm going to have to visit this, what was it called? Music Escapades website, because it sounds like whoever engineered and designed these little teaching tools had a lot of the same, went through a lot of the same trials and tribulations that we're speaking about, and innovated their way to a solution that you can actually, that's palpable, which is how a lot of people learn, hands on.
Yeah, absolutely. Music escapades. My big takeaway is that doesn't need to be all or nothing. It doesn't need to be, it's either guide notes or the highway. Perhaps I am a little bit too judgmental about mnemonics. Perhaps I am a little bit too judgmental. We'll see. But I think that being okay with trying to mix separate approaches to something is an important um, skill and an important thing to be comfortable with doing, because one size does not fit all, and a hybrid of lots of different things might be what's best for your students. So not being afraid to try out things that traumatized me as a child, I suppose. I have nightmares about all cows eating grass.
I would be so interested to hear from our audience, like, and even just from friends, colleagues, people that we've met in university, like, what is your take on the mnemonic debate? Do you love it, hate it, indifferent, anything and everything in between? What do you do, when it's time to really teach the nitty gritty of staff reading to your students?
Yeah, for sure. If you are interested in sharing your voice, there will be an episode. The episode will be posted to the Defined Music Teacher Facebook page, where you can comment if you are interested in sharing your approach to teaching staff reading. But that is it for us for now. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.
Bye.